What's up, everybody, and welcome to your lesson about cities and urban land use. So a couple of quick definitions before we get started. Remember that the ecumene is places where people can permanently live on Earth. A great example of something that is not ecumene is like a desert or Antarctica. You can live there, but it takes a whole lot of help, and without all of that help, like places that support your life there, you're not going to be able to survive. So the ecumene is places that are permanently inhabited by people. Remember that urban is areas like cities with high concentrations of people. Suburbs are areas that are around the urban areas that are primarily residential for people to live in and usually work in the urban area. Then rural is areas like farms or villages with low concentrations of people. Now, as far as the earliest cities and things like that, we know that God made Adam and God made Eve, and from them all men spring, and the earth is populated in that way. But there are actually a couple of different places where the first major cities take off. Now, there is debate, obviously, about the age of the earth, and AP Human Geography is going to probably put a different date on this than we Christians would, because that's just the way that they view things. But remember that there is agreement that about 6,000 years ago, you start to see early humans, you start to see early human movement specifically, and that is some of the places that you have your earliest urban hearths, which are like where these city movements form. You've got the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. That's where we think the Garden of Eden was. The Nile River Valley, often mentioned in Scripture, right? The Indus River Valley in modern Pakistan, the Huanghe floodplain in China, the Mesoamerica in modern-day Mexico, and the Andean region in South America. So those are the urban hearths that you usually see are kind of the upspring of each different continent. So urbanization is the process of developing towns and cities. And so just a couple of like general terms here. Reurbanization is returning to live in the city after you leave it. Exurbanization is moving farther out into rural areas and working remotely. A satellite city is when an established town near a very large city grows into a city independent of the larger one. So there's a couple of different terms here. Metropolitan area is a collection of adjacent cities across which population density is high and continuous. Basically, cities come together and kind of form a larger one. Denver is an example of that. Metropolitan statistical area consists of a city of at least 50,000 people with surrounding county or cities that have a connection with the urban core. Micropolitan is cities of more than 10,000 but less than 50,000. Remember that transportation is such a massive part of getting around in the city. This is where you get Bockert's epochs of urban growth. Basically, the ways of transportation that allowed cities to grow. So first off, in the 17 and 1800s, you've got the sail wagon. Basically, what's going to happen is water ports are the most important for travel at this time. You had to travel by boat. Poor road conditions make long-distance travel difficult. It was very hard to travel via road in the 17 and 1800s. Iron horse, which is like steam engine-powered boats, and then rail networks starting to spring up in the mid to late 1800s. But then in the late 1800s to 1920, you've got transcontinental railways that are going across the country. You've got cities built up along the railways. This is the steel rail epoch. And then you've got auto air amenity, 1920 to 1970s, where cars are allowing you to spread out. You're able to fly. Traveling is a lot easier. And then now high technology and eco-friendly, which is what we are in now, the 1970s to today. Mass transit, biking, walking, Skype, or like Google Meet to be a little more current. And then jets, and then maybe even eventually space travel. Now, a couple of different things here. The gravity model. Places that are larger and closer together will have a greater interaction than places that are smaller and farther away. So, for example, cities that are big and close to each other are going to typically interact, like New Orleans and Houston. But then cities that are smaller and farther away, they're not going to interact much. Like, you don't hear often of people leaving Covington and going to, like, I don't know, Jackson, Mississippi, that's a little bit smaller, right? There's no connection between the town. But in bigger cities, because of the gravity model, you do hear a lot about people who live in New Orleans, and sometimes they go work in Houston because those are both big markets. The big cities are drawn to each other in that way. And then the rank size rule. Remember the idea that if a country is well urbanized, its largest city is going to be twice as big as its second largest city, and then the largest city is going to be is going to be 3 times bigger than the third largest city, and it goes down in rank like that. If there is one city that is way bigger, like it's got 10 million and then the closest has 500,000, that 10 million city would be a primate city. So remember central place theory, developed by Walter Christaller, developed to explain the distribution of cities of different sizes across a region. Why are cities distributed the way that they are? Central place is a location where people go to receive goods. It doesn't have to be a major city, but you have to be able to do a service there. For example, like MD Anderson in Texas, a lot of people travel there specifically for getting their cancer fixed or getting it looked at, right? And so some sort of service provided by a town and making it a central place. The market area is the thing that surrounds each central place, and it provides goods to that central place. So on that topic, you've got threshold. Remember, threshold is the size of population necessary for any service to exist and remain profitable. Basically, are there enough people there to buy your product? If not, you're not meeting the threshold, and likely your business is not going to be very successful. Range is the distance people will travel to obtain specific goods. Like if you really care about some item, you will travel a long way to get it. For example, Disney World, right? If Disney World were super lame, no one would drive all the way to Orlando for it or all the way out to California for it. But because Disney World is not super lame, it has a large range and you will travel to it. Remember, of course, and we talked about this a ton, megacities and metacities. Megacities have more than 10 million people. Typically, megacities are not going to have a super high standard of living across the board because often there are slums there and the standard of living is not great because it is very densely populated. Metacities are cities that have more than 20 million people. World cities like New York, London, Tokyo, and Paris, cities that have influence beyond their immediate region and really go all over the world as far as like stocks, communication, setting culture, things like that. And so that is the big thing as far as city origins. Now, moving into the rest of what we've discussed so far, and that is the urban models. Now, the urban models are tough, but they classify and categorize land use in urban areas. That is why we need them. So remember the idea of functional zonation, a fancy way to say that different zones in a city serve different functions. That's the big thing here, right? Basically, if you see a zone that is the CBD, the Central Business District, that's going to be the commercial heartbeat of the city. The zone of transition, land use fades between industrial factories and low-class housing. Basically, this is where you start to stop seeing everything being industrial and start to see people living here, or it's the transition area between the businesses that are there and maybe where people sell the things that they make at the businesses. And then the commuter zone, the outer edge of a residential area for whose commute into the CBD for work, right? So remember that the CBDs are typically going to be at the historic heart of the city. The land cost in the CBD is going to be extremely expensive. Remember the idea of bid-rent theory. The more close you get to the center of the city, the more expensive land is going to be. The zone models, of course, I'm not going to go through each one of them here, mostly because this is not the best way to learn about them. It's mostly by looking at them. But you've got the concentric zone model, which was the first model to explain the distribution of different social groups. This was in Chicago historically. That's the concentric zone model. Then you've got the sector model, which is also the Hoyt sector model, just referred to interchangeably. A city develops in a series of sectors extending from the center, also based on Chicago. Then you've got the multiple nuclei model by Harris Ullman, and that's two last names, by the way. A complex city structure that includes more than one center around which cities revolve. So here it's not just the CBD, but a couple of different areas, and this is a more modern model with the multiple nuclei. Now, the issues with these city models is that oftentimes they are way too simplistic, and no model can perfectly explain the way that a city is laid out, and oftentimes they are seen as being too dated because people are designing cities differently now. But another example of the models is the Galactic City model by Harris, created by Chauncey Harris. It's suburbs spread outward from a declining CBD. Many downtowns are called edge cities. Urban Realms model by Vance. These models are large. They have a late 20th century United States city look. Each realm of the model is separate and used for a different purpose. Let me get into what are more foreign models. The Latin American city models by Griffin Ford. Here is where you're going to start to see things like slum, industrial areas. You still see zone of transitions, you still see zone of maturity, but a lot of times what you see is like squatter settlements, and oftentimes that causes problems that we're going to talk about here in just a minute. And then you've got the Southeastern Asian cities. No CBD in the Southeastern Asian city model, but several components of the CBD are present kind of throughout the city. It's a little more spread out in that way. Then you've got Sub-Saharan African cities. The central city has 3 CBDs. Usually there is a CBD that was a colonial and mostly white CBD. Then you've got the traditional CBD, which is a zone of one-story buildings. And then the market CBD, which is more local, is open air, informal economy. Remember, the informal economy is usually not taxed. It's usually like shops, markets, things like that the locals sell. Such an important word when we talk about cities is infrastructure. Infrastructure is the basic physical and organizational structures needed for the operation of a society, like transportation, roads, airports, ports, things like that for boats, ports for boats. And then you've got utilities, power, water, all that stuff that if you don't have it, you don't have a thriving city. And that's why urban sprawl is such a tough thing, because as cities expand past where they were planned, especially in foreign countries, you tend to see these squatter settlements pop up that don't have infrastructure because they aren't planned. And a lot of times you see just water sitting out, or you see human waste sitting out and things like that, or you see electricity lines that aren't planned, and so people are getting electrocuted and things like that. You see where buses don't go into slums because there's no plan for buses. A couple of sustainable design initiatives to remedy problems like this: new urbanism, which is mixed commercial, like selling things, and residential areas that are walkable. Basically, you can live where you buy stuff. It doesn't necessarily have to be separate in new urbanism. But then green belts also, an area of open land around a city on which building is restricted, and you've got that green space. Also, slow growth cities, cities that grow slowly rather than rapidly. They have different policy issues than rapidly growing cities because they are trying to control the size of the city. The good thing about these initiatives, is that it reduces sprawl and makes cities more walkable, because most modern American cities are built around the automobile. The only problem is that a lot of times it increases housing costs because you're investing a lot of government programs. That's going to drive up costs. Also, a lot of times this leads to, and especially historically has led to, things like segregation, and notably things like gentrification and things of that nature. So I want to talk about that for just a minute as we talk about urban sustainability. So these are really hot topic issues, but again, we're mostly just looking at them in an extremely apolitical way, just looking at the facts. So remember this really important term, urban planning, a process of promoting urban growth and controlling change in land use, basically planning out your city. Zoning ordinances, regulations that define how property in specific geographic areas can be used. Basically, you can only build your house to this size. You can only use this building as a gym, or you can only use it as a hotel. You can't use it as a restaurant because that's not what this area of town is. Residential zones are areas of the city devoted to where people can live, rather than a commercial zone, which is where they can sell things or make things, or industrial zones, which is where they can manufacture, right? These are just the different ways that you can do that. And there are a lot of trains of thoughts about zoning ordinances. A lot of people think that it makes a neighborhood look too uniform, or allows you to possibly discriminate by saying, hey, this house has to be this big, and in that way you kind of price people out, and people who don't have as much money can't get into neighborhoods. But at the same time, zoning ordinances can be a really good thing because they keep neighborhoods looking nice. They tend to keep more crime out and things like that. A couple of things to remember just about city politics specifically. Remember that municipal refers to the local government and the services it provides, like water, firefighters, police, buses, libraries. Would all kind of fall under the umbrella of infrastructure. The mayor and the city council is part of what is municipal. A municipality refers to a local entity that is all under the same jurisdiction, basically a city. Then annexation, the process of adding land to a city's legal territory. Incorporation, which is legally joining together to form a new city. And then unincorporated areas are populated regions that don't fall within the legal boundary of any city or municipality. And a lot of this, by the way, falls under the umbrella of urban data. This is how we collect all of this. So it all, as always, goes back to the census. The U.S. has a census tract of between 4,000 and 12,000 people. These tracts are divided into subdivided are divided into subdivided block groups, and each block group is further subdivided into blocks. A census block in a densely populated area may be very small, whereas in rural areas it can cover more land. And so this is how they collect census data. This is all urban data, how many people are living in urban areas rather than living in big areas. And of course, as usual, this is based on survey data, it's based on the census, it's based on field studies, and it's based on narratives, just the stories that people tell. Now, urban decay, or blight, this is another word, just basically a sociological process by which a previously functioning city or part of a city falls into disrepair and just not looking very good, not being very good. Also, this word blight, when something doesn't look good within a city, this is very controversial right now, because the question is, do you leave the areas of the city that aren't as nice there so that people can live there, they can afford to live there, but these tend to be lower income areas, these tend to be places that have higher crime rates? Or do you take that area that's not very nice and fix it up and make that part of the city much nicer, but in the process, gentrification occurs, and what often happens is that people who lived there before now can't afford it. So it's one of those really tricky questions of, do you want to fix the city up? Well, yes, of course you do, but do you want people not to have a place to live? Well, that's also kind of tough too, right? So that is the process of gentrification, and again, this is something that we've talked about a lot in class, but it's also a very hot topic right now. And then there's the process of redlining, a process by which banks draw lines on a map and refuse to lend money or to purchase or improve property within the boundaries. And historically, this has been something that was used to discriminate against minority groups. And so just a couple of last things. Remember that as cities go through their existence, a lot of times what can happen is that the industry that was there can leave, and that can lead to things like brownfields, a former industrial commercial site where future use is affected by potential environmental contamination. Like if it was a factory and there's still some chemical stuff in there, it can run off into rivers and things like that. And then gray fields, which are not contaminated, but they're large developed spaces that are now unused. Like the Rust Belt in the middle of America, what used to be manufacturing in places like Ohio, has now gone into disrepair, and those factories are still there. And so this has been your unit on the suburban. And so this has been your lesson on cities and urban land use. I know that it is a lot, and I still didn't get to everything here. If you have any questions on this, please let me know.